Welcome to the National Center for Institutional Diversity's second annual Juneteenth celebration. My name is Dr. Meredith Hope, and I'm a research fellow at NCID. I'm excited to moderate this year's webinar entitled Black and Free, Exploring and Examining Liberation and Freedom in the 21st Century. Although freedom and liberation are often considered synonymous, this Juneteenth, we take another approach. Engaging the thoughts and actions of Black Americans demonstrates that notions of freedom and liberation are contested and diverse. The diaspora's diversity brings to the table numerous ways of working towards a free and liberated world for Black people. Can this world be known in the 21st century? Can freedom and liberation coexist? What obstacles remain to be dismantled and eradicated? Are we already free, and how can this be? Today, we'll be discussing these questions with 5 diversity scholars with expertise in history, community psychology, technology studies, ministry and activism, and mental health. For those of you joining us on social media, we hope that you'll continue to follow this topic online with the hashtag #BlackandFree and follow us on Twitter at UMishNCID. So let's get this session started. I'll turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves alphabetically. Panelists, in your introduction, please include the positionalities or the perspectives from which you'll be speaking today. We will start alphabetically with Dr. Carrie Banton.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Carrie Banton, and I am an associate professor of history and the director of African and African American studies at the University of Arkansas. I explore ideas of freedom, Black freedom, abolition, colonization. I explore the African diaspora, its history from slavery to freedom. And as an immigrant to the United States, I will also be speaking from that perspective today as well. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Phillip Butler. I'm an assistant professor of theology and Black post-human artificial intelligence systems. It's a mouthful, I know. My work looks at the intersection of neuroscience, technology, spirituality, and Blackness. I engage in the colonial studies, post-humanity, more so as anti-humanity. I'm sure we may get into that a little bit later today. But I'm also the founder of the Secret Project, which is distinctly Black artificial intelligence entity with mental health capabilities, whereby we provide low-cost, 24/7, readily available conversational tools for folks to decompress, kind of wherever they are. Glad to be here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Jennifer M. Gomez. Thrilled to be on this panel with so many wonderful scholars. As we were saying in the prep, happy to learn from everybody. I'm currently an assistant professor at Wayne State University in clinical psychology and also MIPSI, which is the Merrill Palmer Skillman Institute for Child and Family Development. For the academic year of 2021 to 2022, I'll be a fellow at Stanford University's Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. I'll be writing my academic book on cultural betrayal, sexual violence, and healing for Black women and girls in the context of Black Lives Matter and Me Too. And my frame is a Black feminist trauma researcher with a focus on cultural betrayal, violence, mental health, and social justice. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, everyone. My name is Latrician Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I currently serve as the Regional Director of Black Campus Ministries with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship in Michigan. I've spent the better part of the last 10 years working with Black undergraduate students with a particular emphasis at predominantly white institutions. I'm presently in the process of gaining credentials and licensure in clinical social work and infant mental health, and in ordination with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, also a mouthful. My passions and learning interests include the historical Black church, partnership across the Black diaspora, decolonized approaches to community service and international work, and joyful youth engagement. I'm a daughter of the South, born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, and I love to live life with people and committed to elevating the voices in the margins. Great to be here.
My name is Dominique Thomas. I'm the editor of The Community Psychologist, which is the newsletter for the Society of Community Research and Action, which is Division 27 of the American Psychological Association. That was a lot to say, but my PhD is in community psychology, and my specific research, my interests are in campus racial climate on universities, and as well the Black radical tradition of organizing in Black communities throughout the diaspora. So not only just how this activism and this work happens on college campuses, but how it's happened historically throughout the centuries as well. And I'm also really interested in decolonizing knowledge sharing. So changing the ways in which we share and disseminate scholarly or scientific knowledge to people in ways that are actually accessible to them and not hidden behind so much the barriers of paywalls and excessive jargon. And I was born in Gulfport, Mississippi, so I come with a perspective of being a Black man from the deep South, from a low-income Black neighborhood in Mississippi. So I come with all these different perspectives and how I move through these different spaces, which are sometimes elite spaces.
A big thank you to our panelists. We have some pre-written questions, and our panelists will take turns sharing their insight and expertise. I encourage the panelists to keep their remarks under 2 minutes for each question that they feel led to answer. To you, our audience, we anticipate that you'll have questions and lots of them. During the session, please share your question in the Q&A below. This session is being recorded. I'd like to start us off with a question directed towards Dr. Banton. Writer James Baldwin once remarked that people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. What is the role of history in our understanding and pursuit of freedom and liberation in Black America?
Thank you so much for that question. I think there's no better way to start than with James Baldwin, who wrote the wonderful book, The Fire Next Time in 1963, and told us that the greatest reward that this constant interrogation of the brutality of my country is that it has freed me from a host of myths, right? And he said that white America need to shatter the myths that has secured its innocence. And this requires discarding the history that traps us in the categories of race and histories that justify the belief that white people matter more than others. And, these categories that arrest our ability to recreate ourselves and to imagine a more just world, right? And instead of doing that, we're bound to a kind of thinking that orders the world on the back of Black people and fixes the place of white people in legend and myth. And so Baldwin noted that according to Baldwin, the American Negro has had the great advantage of never having believed that collection of myth that white Americans so claim, right? Because, to be trapped in these myths, it means that other people catch hell because of it. And, he talks about the ways that, that it keeps us from creating our better selves and creating a better world. And it keeps us stuck right where we are, failing to see the reality of others, to a kind of blindness and a kind of moral failing, especially with regard to Black people. And that this stands at the heart of this country and has blocked the way for a more democratic future. And so for Baldwin, freedom means the end of that innocence. So what I think that question really tries to get at from Baldwin's perspective is that history and historical context, in fact, if we think about it, it connects the fire next time of Baldwin and the fire this time that we're seeing going on right now. And it puts the work of the activists of previous generation and activists and scholars from that time, whatever spectrum they may have been on, whether they were radical or left, and it puts them in conversation with the people of this time, right? In this this conversation about the historical struggle against racism, right? The strategies of political organizing, and it offers us much needed context and nuance regarding, decisions as recent as the efforts to block voting rights and other efforts geared towards the Black freedom struggle so that we can be better prepared for that fight. That is what history offers us. If we know that suffragists and lawmakers who sought the ratification of the 19th Amendment accommodated and in some cases embraced anti-Black racism, you know, and work to install poll taxes and literacy tests that prevented Black women from casting ballots, right? History can animate that struggle for us that has gotten us to this point. And so the process through all these visions of Black freedom and the movements for Black freedom has been understood, whether it's the efforts to, you know, dismantle racism and capitalism as two sides of the same coin. If we were not to look at that historical context, we would have a very narrow and limited understanding of the pursuit of freedom in Black America. So, you know, in addition to that, that context might help us, you know, guard against the frustrations of the moment in a society that explicitly frames history in the context of freedom for white elites, right? So the fact that Black people live under authoritarian rule, where they're subject to violence and imprisonment without trial and whatnot, you know, informs our that context once we bring history into it. So that history is very important.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banton, for that insight. I'd like to invite a couple of the other panelists to follow up on that. Do you have any thoughts? What is the role of history in our understanding in the pursuit of freedom and liberation in Black America?
I think what I would just add really quickly, the work I do is on violence and how, because of the context of racism within group violence in the Black community, has its cultural betrayal because it's a violation of our in-group solidarity because of this racism. And so for my lab, I had them read some of the seminal work by Kimberly Crenshaw, founder of Intersectionality, from 89 and 91. And one of my students said, oh, like this sounds like cultural betrayal. And I was like, no. Like cultural betrayal sounds like intersectionality in some pieces about racism and sexism and classism, all impacting and oppressing Black women and their experience of violence. And so really important, as Dr. Banton was saying, to understand that history, like nothing really is new under the sun. And when we know that, then we can just be kind of standing and building on what's already been created by the legends before us.
Thank you. Dr. Butler?
Sure. I just want to trouble the term freedom a little bit, mainly because I'm curious about what happens when we become so-called free, mainly because the ways in which we all are interconnected suggest that we are now somehow obligated to maintain that freedom, which is not necessarily like a particular type of freedom. And so it places another level of burden upon us. And then if we look at history, like we say, if we look at Haiti as an example, someone a country who has been able to find its independence, but now has alienated itself from whiteness in a particular way. What is, and then the subsequent kind of tumultuous, you know, a chain of events in terms of its own relationship with America and other countries and its continued relation with France. What does it mean then when we get to the space of either independence or freedom, and then what does that freedom mean, and how do we either stay within that web, allow for a sense of dignity and further relationality once we burst through that framing, and then what is it, and then what do we do, right? What does it mean when Black people quote unquote win, and we achieve this status, or we achieve this new reality, and what does it mean for us to maintain our alienation from whiteness and be able to sustain ourselves and then defend ourselves in a kind of this kind of anti-colonial maintenance of space that we are now carving out for ourselves.
A brief thought, but thank you. When I hear Dr. Gomez talk about her students encountering intersectionality and being struck by the similarities between that and these new concepts that they're learning, I think one of the simplest ways to know that how history impacts freedom is to know history and to have a deep honor for not just the ideas and the people and the thinkers, but the real stories of the people that we come from and our own heritage. I mean, it reminds me deeply of what's happening in the political landscape with regards to how history and how our understandings of race and racial education they're being restricted from our youth. And I mean, if we imagine that these concepts that are striking our folks that are in their 20s and that are in the undergraduate sector, can you imagine outside of the academic walls how that is impacting people, that we are missing such critical parts of our history and understanding of how that impacts who we are today. That feels huge when it comes to how we sort of work out our own freedom.
I would agree with all those points. And in terms of the word freedom itself, I'm thinking something similar. Like, what does that really mean in terms of all of the different ways in which we're interconnected, and then on larger scales, how we see injustice and lack of freedom happening. So what does freedom mean for us being here in the United States as an imperialist power that has put other countries and other nations in colonial or oppressive or subjective types of positions? So what does freedom for us mean when we live in a colonizing imperial power that makes other places not free? And what does it mean for us as Black people who are professionals to be free when there are other Black people who are in prison for, you know, nothing that they should really be in prison for, because most of it's nonviolent crime, and some of it's even people who are there under false pretenses. So what does freedom mean when so many people are actually not free? Like, does freedom actually exist when so many are not free? Or is it just something that only exists in name and gives us something to talk about?
That's a great point, Dr. Thomas. That's a great segue for our second question on political action. During the civil rights movement during the 1950s and 1960s, voting rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer observed that nobody's free until everybody's free. When I liberate myself, I liberate others. If you don't speak out, ain't nobody gonna speak out for you. What voices are you amplifying in your vocational and personal work towards freedom and liberation?
I can take it. I was attempting to step back and make sure I wasn't speaking too much. One for myself is Tarana Burke, and I think she's a great example of Black women in general, really amplifying when Alyssa Milano and other white actresses were talking about Me Too, and it was the Black women who were like, no, this came years before from Tarana Burke as an advocate and an activist. And I have lots of folks on my list, including James Baldwin and Kimberly Crenshaw, and also contemporary scholars as well, like Caritha Mitchell, activists like Angela Davis, Rayshawn Ray, Victor Ray, Ellie Sewell, Trisha Ben Goodley, Tima Bryant Davis, so many people who do good work and who are legends in their own right. And we can't forget that just because they're harder to find within like a white supremacist culture that is necessarily devaluing the work that they're doing within, and then also just outside of the academy in general.
Someone else want to weigh in?
Yes, I would also like to add to that, especially for those of us who are in institutions of power and are considered part of the Black elite. I think it's incumbent upon us to amplify the voices of those Black people who society would consider not respectable, right? There's been a lot of discussion around bonnets and all those kinds of things that might make some Black people not be worthy of the kind of love or appreciation. But I think it's so very important, whether it's Black women rappers, Meg Thee Stallion or Cardi B, who people might have certain views about because of their jobs, or sex workers, or poor Black women. We have to understand our voices, that we have relative class positions, and be careful as to not be replicating some prior respectability politics that have um, you know made the foundations of other movements that came before us, but also the kinds of white facing directionality that tends to take over Black freedom movements and Black social lives. So I think those voices of the Black poor, the people who we call the least of these, very important.
Thank you, Dr. Banton. Would someone else like to jump in and follow up on those comments?
I think for me, right, it's a straight cis Black male scholar, right. I'm intentional about including Black queer women, including trans folks, and including gay men in my own scholarship, and to make sure I'm lifting up those voices as well. And I think in particular, right now I've been kind of looking through. They're looking at Roger Sneed's work, right, in terms of, so I'm working on this one chapter on Black theology and artificial intelligence. And so I'm looking at including Roger Sneed's works. Yatunde's work, she's a Black lesbian, a Buddhist, and one of her critiques of Black theology in itself is that, at least in womanism, is that Alice Walker was a queer lesbian, but within womanism, the trajectory has been to be more Christian. And so kind of re-entangling kind of Black queer lesbians into this work of thinking about what womanism is, and where it ought to go and things like that. And so just kind of being intentional about who I'm including in the work, but also recognizing that kind of citation is its own political act. And so I do my best to engage as many Black folks as possible. I was talking with some folks like James Cone had to talk about Tillich, right? And he had to engage with Bart, but we're at a place now, kind of 50, 60 years later, where we can, if we want to, we can write the whole text just by engaging the voices of other Black scholars. So this is kind of the work how I'm doing it in my work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Butler. I have a follow-up question I'd like to hear from some of the other panelists. What voices are missing? And what voices are being overlooked in the Black community, and how can we amplify them? Are there any strategies or ideas that you have about ways to amplify these missing voices?
I think one set of voices often overlooked, or at least not given the space that they should be, are students, whether it's graduate students or undergraduate students. Like, a lot of times they kind of get left behind in terms of who gets to be in the room with these types of discussions, especially when many times they're the ones who are actually putting their bodies on the line in protest to actually change and improve conditions. And in some cases, to make sure that there are more Black faculty in places. So historically speaking, students have actually literally put their bodies on the line to make sure that Black faculty can have jobs, and just kind of making sure that students don't continue to always just get the shaft. Because being recently a student and being involved in student organizing and the different power dynamics that come from being a student versus faculty when you're trying to organize, that's a really difficult position. And because of those power dynamics, students are putting themselves at a much more serious risk for getting the weight of the institution like bearing down on them. So I think student voices should be more focused on, because they're often the ones who are most who have the least amount of protection from power, especially graduate students who kind of get caught in between both the complaints of undergraduates and like their graduate mentors as well. So I think one way of helping to amplify different voices would be something like special issues. So for example, I'm doing a special journal issue that's looking at contemporary manifestations of racism and colonialism. So special issues would be a good way of amplifying different voices who don't get to have their work amplified normally, because there's so much stuff that drowning them out, so much of the mainstream status quo things that are getting published over and over drown people out, drown out new voices. So creating new special issues that open up the terrain for people to talk about their work would be a good way of including overlooked voices and talking about things from different perspectives.
What a wonderful idea. Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. Lots to think about there. Reverend Mitchell, do you have any comments?
I do. Thank you. I honestly feel very encouraged as I answer this question, because I feel that the last decade has brought so much movement with regards to whose voices are at the forefront. There's still a lot of work to do, but I mean, even a few years ago, I would have said that we're missing major representations of young people and some of the cases of queer and LGBTQ voices in the Black community, but we are so lucky that the contemporary freedom movements have been quick to assert everyone's right to be at the table. That is one of the gifts of Gen Z to our community and to the movements. I know for myself, I've learned a lot in the last several years about ability and empowering disabled folks and folks who experience neurodiversity. That's another space that's often overlooked. There's a lot of work to do when it comes to undoing the damage of classism, Black elitism, and specifically generational that continues to sort of be tied up in really only one section of the Black community. Like there's so many statistics out there. Someone who's done more work on it than me can say even that there are certain that Black academics tend to come from some of the same circles still. It's pretty rare to find many first-gen PhD students and PhDs out there in the world as much as there should be, really. And so I think there is still a lot of work to do, but I also just feel a really positive sense of the folks that are who are forcing their way into the room, not waiting to be allowed in.
Great, thank you. One more voice on this topic before we move on. Any other strategies that you can think of that would be helpful for amplifying voices?
I would just say quickly on a strategy, but along the same lines of students, is children, and that Black children are often overlooked. And one example is that Black girls are 40% of the victims of sex trafficking. Black girls are not 40% of the general population in the US. That's an astronomical number. And when we don't care about children, just like we don't behaviorally always care about students, then it really does so much harm by just dehumanizing Black children.
Thank you so much. We're going to segue to another question. This time, we're going to talk about teaching and community engagement. So here's a question for those of you whose advocacy towards freedom includes teaching others and community engagement. Dr. Thomas, Dr. Banton, and Reverend Mitchell, I hope you'll weigh in here as well. In The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire writes that no pedagogy which is truly liberating can remain distant from the oppressed by treating them as unfortunates and by presenting for their emulation models from among the oppressors. The oppressed must be their own example in the struggle for their redemption. Thoughts, reactions?
I just thought about the like those re-education camps that they sent indigenous people to when they basically took their land and forced them on the reservations, or tried to force them to be more civilized. And it's the same thing. Like, you can't really educate someone when you don't respect them as an equal human being and you look at them as something to mold into a better shape. Like there's nothing liberatory about making someone trying to fit a mold of the person who oppresses them. And I think that's why history matters as well too, because the type of history that gets taught from this way of education upholds a specific type of social relation, upholds a particular type of power relation. So it's history and education are so tied together because we learn history through education. And yeah, and presenting a history in which it shows that people are presented as like these unfortunates that needed to be civilized, or or re-educated, or this is the real model that you're supposed to fit. It's he talks too about like the banking model of education, in which students are viewed as like essentially little miniature banks in which you deposit information into, like it's money, but there's no bi-directional process as Ferry would want to like have. Like there's no critical consciousness building. Like you have to present people with models that actually help them be their best selves, not a model of the person who's actually oppressing them.
Thank you, Dr. Banton.
Thank you so much for this question. This question goes to the very heart of my research and my recent book on migration to Liberia, how African-American and Caribbean migrants who went on this civilizing project to Africa to basically to inculcate a kind of whiteness that they had learned by being virtually proximate to white people in the West, to the ethnic groups that who they would find in Africa. Now, that is very important because in the movements for freedom and liberation, we have to think about this question about what is it that we desire. There is a translation of an epigram from Beyond Good and Evil that says, "Battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster. And if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you," which basically, suggests that whoever battles with monsters should also should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster himself. And when you look into the abyss does look into you. So, whether it's the settlers from the United States or the Caribbean who went to Liberia, who took with them not only the physical building blocks that were needed to establish communities and their experiences of slavery and freedom, but also these ideas about what that freedom would mean, right? The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, he said, freedom is what you do with what has been done to you, right? And that, I think, is an appropriate adage, to think about as a point of departure, to explore how we, create these movements and the kinds of power that hide behind, whether it's a religious principle or ideology, whether it's Pan-Africanism or any kind of shallow cross-class Black solidarity. In my position as someone in African and African American studies, thinking about the institution and having to be a part of that institution and the kind of tragedy of that, because the institution necessarily involves more or less a degree of cooptation or appropriation, right, which involves a loss of identity and a particular kind of disruptive power, right? So to become part of that institution, to kind of calcify, into those ideology, I think it's incumbent upon us in Black studies, Africana studies, African American studies. That's why from the very beginning, the architects of these programs, we always kept a foot into the community, because the community will keep you in check. The community will not only ensure that we're not dealing with these kinds of abstract ideas that will not lend itself to any kind of community development, but it will also offer innovation. It will also offer a check on our efforts to be co-opted by the university. And so we have to, think about what this means and whether we're going to be replicating some of the power structures that we were seeking to run from in our quest for freedom, when we're building these movements and when we are teaching these classes.
That's it. No, I definitely agree with all of that. And I mean, if I was to add anything, I guess I would just be curious about what it means then for us to, when we become our own example, what does it mean for us to not create a new subject? Because the subject becomes a standard, and the standard becomes a limitation, which also now puts a cap on what freedom can potentially be. And so I'm just curious about whether it be Pan-Africanism or Black nationalism, whatever it is. Like there's always this new subject. Like Fanon talks about this new human, and I'm like, who's this guy? Who's this person, right? And then the question, so I'm always just leery about setting up another standard. If the standard is intersubjectivity, supposedly, or if the standard is just multiplicity or plurality or complexity, right? If complexity is the subject, potentially I can get with that, and then allowing for that to be the case within larger communities, and giving people the space to not only be themselves, but then be the version of themselves that they might need to be in the next moment, because the next moment may call for a different version of who they are or who they may need to be, which again is not a limitation of who are they supposed to be. And I think that is one of the I think that's me. I don't want to say, because if I was to say it was a call, then that becomes another standard, right? And so I'm just like I'm wondering what it is for us to be on the ground in the communities with folks, and then like dealing with issues like masculinity, right? And this idea of hardness, or just kind of and this idea of what it means to always be a man, always to be dominant, or always to kind of put oneself forward, or just expansive in a way, which also has like these kind of connections with colonialism. But then what does it mean for men to be able to not just regress, but be vulnerable, but also to be pliable in situations, and to listen and to learn, and allow that to be a strength as well. And so kind of allowing for redefinitions to be the case, again, kind of tying back to Freire about, letting words and letting things be defined by you. And so I guess if you were the example, then this kind of, I think the thing that I would lift up is fluidity, and then self-determination and self-definition.
Reverend Mitchell?
Yes, thank you. This quote about pedagogy illustrates and even preaches the truth that Black folks were their own abolitionists. Like, that is just so key to the concepts of Juneteenth. That's Dr. Banton's message to preach. Okay, so I'll leave that to her. But from my vantage point, I can say that this calls to remembrance one of my favorite things about student activism. It has a bad reputation of reinventing the wheel. This is often due to the amendment over that naturally happens among students, and truthfully also partially due to the bravado that often accompanies that season of life. Like, you're just never more sure of yourself than you are in those moments. But one of the most valuable things about student work is that it is often so deeply internally supported and driven that they are not so moved by the strength of the advocacy of others. Of course, people have been moved into the room by the encouragement of administrators or faculty or others who have mentored and cared for them. But it is often that thing inside of someone that moves it forward, is that firm belief that things could be better, that brought them into the next season of the movement. And so I feel, as folks who are called to influence the next generation, we must be so careful to bring hope into our pedagogy. I mean, so often we have a terrible habit, and I think we've all experienced this, of projecting our own experiences of pain, trauma, and mistreatment onto those who we're called to serve. An immense differentiation that is an awareness of self and how we impact those we teach. That's required in order for us to lead and serve with integrity. And it allows our constituents to honor their history, work to create their own path forward, and to embrace hope in their work towards liberation.
Thank you for those thoughts, Reverend Mitchell. That's a great segue to our question on religion and spirituality. From the first time that Africans stepped foot on this land, religion and spirituality have played significant and long-standing roles in their communities, shaping culture, politics, and civic engagement, as well as providing spiritual sustenance and social support for adherents and non-adherents alike. In your view, what is the role of religion and spirituality in Black liberation? I'd like to open this up to Reverend Mitchell to start off with, and then would like to have some follow-up from my other panelists.
Thank you. I know that for me, and often the people I serve, faith in developing our own faith narrative is critical, not only to our freedom, but to our survival. And there's something about this in particular, my comment will actually be short, but something that I want to validate. There's just so much emphasis on deconstruction in our daily life today. And this is especially true with regards to how we navigate concepts of faith and identity. I think some of the most troubling experiences that we have been rooted in compromised integrity, corruption, and ignorance. And that's a really sincere place that I think that we we have the right to enter into as we navigate who we are and how we were made, because these concepts are so much more than just ethereal. Like, they guide each thought. I mean, I often have known and believed that, like, the beginning of the cry that Black Lives Matter was not just a declaration. That's also in a form of a prayer. Like, we are believing and declaring that our lives matter in this world, into the space, or the one. I would say the one, but this is the things that have made us. Yeah, I some of those experiences that we've had of pain. I mean, the unlearning process that we typically attribute to a detachment, I believe could be instead reattributed to how to reattach yourself to these ideas and to deeply connect ourselves to the experiences that those who came before us actually began to understand. I think there's a deep misunderstanding of what the mental experience of those who are of Africans who were enslaved in the U.S., what their experiences with faith were. I think there's a lot of thought that they were that they believed lies that were shared to them, and were under deceit and continue to behave in deceit. But if you read some good slave narratives, you'll learn. I mean, they said not everybody who says they're going to heaven is going there. You know, there's a lot of deep knowledge, and when we begin to reattach ourselves to these ideas of liberation and how we conceive our faith, we begin to reconnect ourselves to the questions that those who came before us were asking and living the answers to. I think that is just deeply important to how we conceive our own faith experience.
I'd like to get somebody else to weigh in. Any responses to that?
So in my first text, I was looking at kind of like the neurophysiology and its connection to spiritual experiences. And one of the things that was finding in my research was that whatever somebody chooses to believe has a profound impact on their entire kind of physiological structure. And so spirituality in connection with religion or not, right, becomes the foundation for how people's bodies respond to the world. And so spirituality, one of the things that I think is that spirituality becomes one of the greater defenses against the outside world, mainly because if one is able to maintain their internal disposition, then the onslaught of what is presented to them by the outside world becomes it's in response to that. And so spirituality allows for the maneuvering right through these trepid waters, right, that we find ourselves in a way that allows us to regain equilibrium and then elevate even further, right? If we're to use kind of words of up and down, but nevertheless, I think the idea that it gives us something to not only recalibrate, but it also allows us to also redirect our entire framework, our entire bodies with a different level of energy, right, and vigor, because depending upon what you believe, it's going to now lead to a particular types of action. And it'll give you a different type of energy that'll undergird the things that you choose to do and the way that you choose to respond to the ways in which the world already is. And then the things that it potentially throws at you. The world in itself is invariable, but your spirituality allows you to be grounded and quote unquote resilient and so on and so forth. And the invariability has less to do with the impact it has on you and more to do with the ways in which you now are in relationship with those things that are happening in its own ways that it pushes you inside, but at the very least gives you a different relationship with yourself and the things that you hold sacred.
Thank you so much. I have a follow-up question. African-American theologian and historian Howard Thurman, in his book For the Inward Journey, comments on freedom, saying often to be free means the ability to deal with the realities of one's own situation as not to be overcome by them. What is your response? Love to hear from someone who may like to comment who hasn't spoken yet.
When I hear that question, I think about as with a lot of other things, I go back to the Haitian Revolution and what the Haitians chose to do at the ceremony of Boué Kéman, how they went back to what they knew. And that prayer from Dutty Bookman, right, that went to their gods and to the system that created them, right? And they had to really tap into a system that, you know, gave them power, humanized them, just like Phillip was saying earlier, that they recognized that there was a white man's God that was, you know, dehumanizing, that was a force against them. And so the ability to collectively tap into that and the kinds of solidarity that it was able to provide for those who participated in that revolution, I think it was so very key for what ultimately became the outcome. So I think that you know, Howard Thurman perhaps was not referring to that directly, but you know, dealing with the reality that they were confronted there with in Haiti and tapping into what they knew as a source of power, I think was very pivotal.
Anybody else have any last thoughts before we leave the topic of religion and spirituality?
I think I'll just say quickly from the follow-up question of the knowing the reality that you're in, and Caretha Mitchell out of Ohio State University's incredible work on white mediocrity and know your place aggression. And so know your place aggression is like, you should know your place and you don't because you're too smart, and so I'm aggressing against you. And white mediocrity. And I have found so much joy when I'm able to identify that's what's going on, as opposed to like, the situation is terrible, period, and I feel bad. But like, oh, you're incompetent. And like, white supremacy got you here. And you're threatened by me because you think I should be grateful for existing and not think I actually belong here. It's a kind of maybe a flip of the reality of the situation. So check out Caretha Mitchell's work. It's brilliant.
Thank you so much for weighing in. All right, we're going to transition to our next topic, mental health and trauma. On this topic, I'd love to hear from Dr. Butler, Dr. Gomez, and Dr. Thomas, given their respective expertise on mental health and community psychology. So here's the question. What role does mental health play in the fight for freedom and liberation? What cultural strengths can Black Americans draw from as they pursue psychological and behavioral health and well-being?
I'll jump in quickly. And I want to be careful when we talk about mental health, because a lot of times the framing is that if you have depression or feel anxiety, then that's bad, like you're suffering. But the flip side of that is sort of like psychopathic, right? Like if you see like police murdering somebody in the street, then like depression would make sense and like anxiety would make sense. And so I think really important to be able to reframe the discussion that in a very non-pathological and non-pathologizing way, that these responses that many of us are having make sense given the context that we're in. And so then it becomes like, okay, if it makes sense, then where can we go from there? And I'll pull quickly from the Psychology of Radical Healing Collective, which identifies 5 anchors for communities of color, including the Black community. And one is collectivism. There's critical consciousness, radical hope, we were talking about before, of making sure that we have the hope infused, and radical hope meaning kind of like against all the evidence that nothing will ever get better, like you still have hope, as well as strength and resistance, and then cultural authenticity and knowledge. And I think that all of those pieces, and kind of the theme that I'm hearing a lot is history, and knowing the history, knowing that we belong to something so much greater than wherever we're sitting in right now, can really be helpful. So holding the truth that there is depression, there is all these terrible things because of the world in which we live, excuse me, and that's okay. And we can still feel joy and still have this radical hope and still be connecting and reconnecting with each other and with everyone who's come before us.
Yeah, no, I just want to echo everything that Dr. Gomez is saying. And I think for me, right, mental health and spirituality kind of go hand in hand because of the particular dispositions that they help to cultivate, right, depending upon And because I think it goes back to even the beginning when Dr. Banton was talking about James Baldwin and even the idea of myth, right? So some folks may not like this, right? But I think one of the things that I argue throughout is that all is myth, all is myth. It already depends on what you believe. And so if you believe something and that it is part of your kind of mental health or part of the epistemology that shapes your entire internal cosmos, or whether it be a particular religion, just a particular kind of ideology or framework, right? That in itself becomes your religion. These are the myths that make up your life or that make up your world. And as a part of that, mental health is about, in many cases, about of making sure that the narratives that we tell ourselves are ones that are generative, the ones that are self-compassionate, ones that give us the opportunity to continue to be different over and over and over again, so that we're not faced with the reasons what happened or why we quote unquote weren't able to do something in the midst of a troubling situation of trauma, so on and so forth. And so a lot of that has to do with forgiving oneself, and which also has these other kind of religious framings attached to it as well. And so again, the belief system that one has, whether it includes a deity or not, all is part of the constellations that make up our world, or the way we understand the reality to be. And as a result of that, the mental health aspect is now tied back to the spirituality for me. And I think as Black folks, given how deeply rooted we are in spiritualities, but regardless of their ties to deities or not, are something that we can draw on. I think that gives us not only just the power, but it also allows us to be framing as well. And I think that we also kind of need to be careful and intentional about embracing our culture in the ways in which it already is self-sustaining in and of itself. I bought quick analogy. I bought my son the Snaps book. I don't know if you guys remember the Snaps book. These are just the collection of the Yo Mama jokes and so forth. And they could be problematic in some ways, but there's a part of a larger tradition of a way folks get together and talk a little bit of trash and build community amongst each other, and also engage in kind of this in this type of just kind of this verbal quips that demonstrate a level of love and just a boundary building as well.
Thank you. Dr. Thomas?
Yeah, I think in terms of mental health, how we frame it is important, because I think we need to think about it in terms of healing, because so much of what we're talking about is trauma that needs to be healed and hasn't been properly addressed. And kind of going back to the previous question about spirituality and religion, a lot of different healing technologies have come from the different spiritual traditions from Africa. So even though all the spiritual traditions didn't look exactly the same, they had enough commonalities, and they also shared a metaphysical inclusivity, so to say. So they recognized that there were other traditions on the continent, but they were all interconnected and could exist coinciding with one another. So which would make it easier for people from different African nations or peoples to come together and connect over these similar spiritual belief systems, so they can either share or maintain or continue to pass down these different healing technologies and systems throughout history, even if they start to change form and look a little different because of the specific context. So we think about, the priests back in Africa who share a lineage with the hoodoo doctors on the plantation, who share a lineage with the preachers, who also share a similar lineage to us as teachers and scholars. Like, we're all in that same lineage of African diasporic thinkers who are trying to use our powers to help heal our people, whether it's through more traditional healing technologies or also, what knowledge we can help to illuminate for people.
Reverend Mitchell?
Yes, thank you. And with response to the second part of our question about I would phrase it in the sense of what cultural strengths belong to us in our journey towards mental health. I really think that much of what can be used in our arsenal are the things that we're naturally made for. And I think that's been spoken to from other panelists here. But it's remarkable that formal mental health is still stigmatized in our community and others to be this sort of white or majority culture invention. While, I mean, many of our cultural values immediately point to like a community pursuit towards wholeness and shared vulnerability. Like that communal nature of Black community has helped us to achieve what I would call like an external vulnerability. You know, folks are always aware of what's going on the outside. There's no such thing as a secret when the right auntie or uncle is within earshot. You know, instead of pushing us to shame and obsessive privacy, like our communal nature should be empowering us to pursue inner vulnerability with boldness, trust, and a collective desire to be more healed as families, faith spaces, or organizations. As the other panelists have alluded already, healing in this area is our historical birthright. And I do believe that if we were to take some creative ways and claims to think about how we can address these things as a people and as a community. For example, if folks could think of, I think some of them probably already exist, but some empowering ways to do family therapy that don't embarrass people and make you afraid to even do it, or ways to approach the older generations about how to approach and engage mental health. There are all kinds of ways that we as people can begin to like embrace the things that are already within us.
And to close up on our question on mental health and trauma in the Black community journey towards freedom and liberation, I'd love to hear a quick comment by Dr. Banton.
You know, I'm so pleased that this is a discussion that is ongoing in the Black community and has received so much attention in recent times. For a people who have been battling with so much trauma historically, the forces that have preserved white supremacy and sought to, you know, make us socially dead. I think that attending to these kinds of psychological issues and the ways in which us as a community internalize habits from you know, a white supremacist culture that might be damaging to not just us as individuals but also to the community, and or kind of in recent times facing towards Africa, whether it's turning back towards religion, whether it's Santeria, Obia, you know, voodoo, and so on, to seek some kind of reprieve from this kind of a system. I find it, you know, so very enriching, and I welcome these kinds of discussion to kind of buttress what is going on in so many of the communities across this country and the diaspora in terms of attending to this work, and that we have these kinds of connection that we can have online to see, make it visible that it is fine, and that we can, you know, have approaches that does not necessarily fall in line with the official way of approaching them, but, you know, in our own ways, as Dr. Butler referred to earlier.
Thank you, Dr. Banton. As we transition, the time is going by fast. All right, we have a question about allyship. In the journey, in the battle, in the thriving, and in the struggle, some might consider that our discussion of Black freedom and liberation necessitates commentary on the role of allyship. But others, like civil rights movement organizer and freedom writer Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, disagree. In What We Want, he says, Black people must do things for themselves. This does not mean we don't welcome help or friends, but we want the right to decide whether anyone is, in fact, our friend. We will not be told whom we should choose as allies. With this in mind, how does allyship play a role in Black liberation and freedom? And a follow-up question, what criteria might be used to determine who is an ally? Welcoming comments from all the panelists. Please keep your comments within under a minute. Thank you.
Oh, pressure. So I would say first, being an ally to others. So currently the Israeli government is engaging in horrible violence and apartheid against Palestinians. And we are Black people, but we do exist with people who are not Black, and engaging in allyship to others helps our collective freedom across borders and across groups. I think for other people to be allies with us, what I think about is honoring our self-determination, supporting from the back, which means don't tell us how to do it from the front, but supporting from the back, and then talking with your people from the front. And so you need to go talk to your other white people who are being very problematic yourself, because a racist is not going to listen to me. So you have to do that part. And I think what I would add in terms of how to be a bad ally is speaking about sympathy and how much you care while doing absolutely no behavior and no action to change the systems. So if I'm saying our system is corrupt and you say, I hear that you're frustrated and I care about that, leave it. I don't want to hear it anymore unless you're actually working towards change with the power that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Gomez, for those thoughts. I'd love to hear from Dr. Banton and Dr. Mitchell, Reverend Mitchell.
I would echo Dr. Gomez's thoughts, especially about white people and, taking up the white man's burden and go be a missionary unto your people. I think that's the most prolific work that white people can engage in now. I think, the normal action has been to do the white saviorism, whether it's here in Africa or the diaspora, it's the normal impetus. But if we can, as Black people, recognize our own lanes and, the places that we can have power, I'd call on allies to do the same in terms of recognizing their own spheres of power, recognizing that Black freedom exists in a kind of dialectical relationship to many different things. So if they're in healthcare or, whether they're in, mental health or any kinds of institution, and they can play a role wherever they are, that they should be. And in fact, not to come and then take up the spaces where Black people are trying to lead and trying to be a voice in their community in order to inject their ideas of what freedom should look like for our community. So I would say the most that they can do is to educate fellow whites.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I couldn't agree more with what's been said. I do a lot of sort of work that's very personal and interface with lots of people that are maybe white or white aligned who aim to be allied together in the work of liberation. I just don't think most people know how hard it really is to do that, to actually aid in liberation and not accidentally aid in the oppression. I mean, personally, I welcome allyship and partnership, but I'm just not. I'm in a place where I have. I no longer give that the center of my attention anymore. One of the greatest thefts of systematic racism is time, and I refuse to give any more of it to only being a racial educator. I'm sure others here or in the audience can resonate with that. And though I no longer give that the center of my time, I can say that the best forms of allyship, if I can give some advice, are those that are relentlessly specific, which isn't really what we want to hear. We kind of want to be able to share about whatever's happening that week and then repost it and then amplify the one person we know from that people group that is doing that work and just repost their thing and give them a few bucks and then go back to our home and go to sleep. But if you were to find the places that intersect the most with your own commitments and be willing to give of yourself to the point of great discomfort and to just be willing to lean into that, there's so many examples in history. So I would encourage you to find history, whether that's in abolition or in the civil rights movement, even like how folks who chose their lane, as has been said, were willing to give of their time, the resources, and et cetera, to make those things happen. That's really key.
Thank you. Anyone want to follow that up?
Yeah, I would agree with all the points being made, and it makes me think about how some people now are starting to use the term co-liberator or co-conspirator instead of ally, because it might imply much more of an active nature on behalf of the person who is the ally or quote co-liberated. And it's the idea that everyone's liberation is bound up with everyone else's liberation. So you can't liberate me, you have to liberate yourself, and I have to liberate myself. So we all have to, like, we have to liberate ourselves from white supremacy, and white people have to help other white people liberate themselves from white supremacy. So the idea of everyone's liberation being bound up with one another and everybody having to be co-liberators.
Yeah, nah. Again, I agree with what everybody's saying. The only thing I add is I'm not. I think I echo Brother Mitchell's sentiments about not necessarily believing folks when they say that they're ally, and I'm always just skeptical. But what I am interested in is in folks who are willing to betray whiteness and to be active in their ways of creating fissures in whiteness and to continue to fracture it because of of the way in which it presents as this kind of unified or universalist front. And so if folks are willing to betray whiteness, I'm cool with that. And then criteria is just time. And so if you want to overcome my skepticism, then demonstrate your willingness to betray whiteness over and over again. And then maybe we can talk about something else.
Thank you to all of our panelists. Unfortunately, we have only one more question before we open it up for the numerous wonderful responses we got from our viewers and our audience members. So with no further ado, given this current socio-political climate and context of the United States, how do you envision freedom and liberation within Black communities going forward into the 21st century? Please keep your responses brief and concise, as we have a lot of audience questions that we'd like to get to.
I can start from Nina Simone, who said to be free to me was no fear. And that was such a powerful statement to me of behaviorally having no fear is one thing, that you do things even if you're afraid and so on, but psychologically having no fear. And in 2020, I was thinking, are we going to go to civil war? Like we might legit like have an insurrection and go to civil war, or we'll keep the status quo, which is also killing people and murdering people's souls. And with either of those, neither looks good to me, but it was a no fear of, again, nothing new under the sun. This is the first hostile, oppressive government that's ever been. And if I live or if I die in this moment, for as long as I'm breathing, I belong to myself and kind of this to us in this kind of spiritual, transcendent across time way. And there's freedom in that there isn't in my kind of most grounded moments, reasons to be afraid when you get to still be alive and still get to have your breath and your moments and your connection. So living with that kind of no fear to me is freedom. Borrowing from Nina Simone.
Dr. Banton or Dr. Butler, would you like to follow that up?
I was trying to defer it to Dr. Banton, but what does Envision to me? It looks like Black majority cities. Like if I'm just looking at just kind of painting a picture, it's Black majority cities. It's Black folks engaging in technological work and being the progenitors of new technological fronts. It's Black folks being able to not only arm themselves but train themselves in how to do that and maintain that. It's the maintenance of municipalities, right? So not only Black majority cities, but what does it mean when the Black majority is also governing themselves in the sense of that there's Black mayors, Black governors, right? The Black police officers, if we believe in police at all in these spaces, right? If the magistrates, right? What does it mean for Black folks to be in power in these spaces in the 21st century? We got 100 years to not only envision this, but put it together. And maybe, I guess really we got 79 left. So yeah, in short, that's kind of what it looks like.
I think
Dr. Banton?
Sorry about that, Dominic. um, uh, thinking about the long freedom struggle, and, freedom, as we know, is a constant struggle, and thinking about it in this current century and what it would mean. I think I am pleasantly, impressed with this current generation of individuals, whether it's people who are, buying up large swaths of land and are building communes in Georgia and, working together. What is going on with Chakwe down in, Jackson, places like that, where they're building radical movements that are not replicating what the dominant system has been doing, and being careful not to replace one policeman with the other, right? So I think being free in this current space and time is being cognizant of those behaviors that keeps us trapped, that we have to be one way, that we have to remain beholden to this idea that a white supremacist society have carved out for us, and realize that, we can live our best lives in multiple dimension and show up as ourselves. So um, we have lots of latitude, I think, in the 21st century to exercise our idea of what we think freedom should be.
Thank you so much. We are at our time for audience questions. We've received a lot, so thank you, panelists, for sharing your expertise, insight, and bandwidth with us. We are moving into the audience engagement part of our time together. Friendly reminder to the panelists to keep your responses as short as possible so that we can answer as many questions as possible. Our first question is directed toward Reverend Mitchell. This question says, after studying Black history, do you find it to submit to European-based religions like Christianity? Are Rastafarians in Jamaica the direction we should be heading as far as a Black supreme being? Very interesting question, Dr. Reverend Mitchell.
Thank you. And I want to respond to this with sensitivity because, as I said in my previous response about faith and spirituality, the way that we identify ourselves in this struggle and in this journey is deeply personal and comes attached to our own experiences of wounds and the ways that we bring in information. I can say that from my vantage point and in my own journey, my growing understanding about the history of particularly how do I say this, of Black folks throughout history and their own understandings about what they've learned about faith traditions that they've been exposed to. And I would say the presence of I would say of Christianity in Africa long before the presence of Europeans. For me, I don't struggle with the intellectual component of whether or not those things are present and were present for Black folks before white folks gave us that information. I do struggle with the sort of generalization of something that was of my worship of a Palestinian leader in the Middle East having become this Western white thing that I do feel has been tainted and has been used to harm truly millions of people. Folks have the right to make their own decisions about where and how they make their own sort of faith vows to what they believe in and how they journey. I just believe that it should be done in a way that empowers those who have come before us and empowers the history and their decisions. Yeah, it's very meaningful to be able to find ways to identify, okay, who identifies with the struggle and in suffering. And I do think those things can be found within the Christian faith, but they're also found in other expressions of how to understand yourself. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. I have another question. What advice do you have for students and allies in predominantly white educational spaces in their quest for freedom and liberation? Love to hear from someone who's in an educational space.
Yeah, I would just say quickly that so white supremacy obviously is like lays within all of institutions, but how it gets instantiated is on a continuum. And so if you're in an environment that is just so hostile and you're getting beaten up every day, that is not every single environment actually. And so holding on to the reality and the knowledge that there are other environments that are still white supremacist and still have lots of problems, but also have more capacity for movement and where you would be more appreciated and more respected. There's more of a critical mass of people. And so I think for me as a student, when I was a student and looking at my students now, being able to really communicate that piece, that it isn't this kind of one way that's always going to be terrible. So get the skills that you want to get now, and then be looking for a place that's going to be good enough for you to begin with, and that has the potential to get better.
I would also like to add, as someone who's in the university space, that I am so impressed with the movements that we've seen from students, whether it's here at our own University of Arkansas, the Black at UR campaign, or at what those students did at Missouri some years ago, and all across what's happening with the NCAA as athletes or student athletes are reclaiming their power. I find it so enriching and so it energizes me as someone who is also on campus. So what I would say to students is to recognize that you do have your power. And I think a big part of that is trying to form coalitions on campus with other students from other groups, right? Because you are a very powerful faction, and recognize the ways that the institution might fear you rising up. Lots of institutions don't take too kindly to bad publicity, so it's in those kinds of responses, I would say leverage that, make your public voice and your public platform a source of power for you and for the groups that you're advocating for. You're doing unpaid work on campus in many of these spaces, and so, leverage all the sources of power that you do have. People like Dominique, who, help, with organizing and so on. Get together, get your strategies and techniques together, and be the force that you can be in whatever spaces you are.
Thank you so much. Would Dr. Thomas like to quickly chime in on that question?
Something I would just kind of add to is, if possible, keep in touch with students who then go on to graduate, because sometimes that former student could be a resource or someone who could be on your side when it comes time to take some type of collective action at the university setting. So if you have a former colleague or friend who was a student who's now a PhD, they may be a person who can be on your side as another person who has authority, who can actually back you up and be an equal to the other administrators that you may be having to deal with. So keep in contact with people who graduate, because they may be able to have power and come back and help you as an outsider.
Thank you. Our next question has to do with the topic of immigration in the Black community. How can Black people make the connection between the policing of communities of color and the policing of immigrant communities to create intersectional solidarity to confront problematic issues within these communities? Anybody want to take a stab at answering that?
I guess I can, as an immigrant myself, speak to that in some kind of way. I know there's several movements that have emerged in recent times, whether it's American descendants of slaves or, foundational Black Americans, and that has sought to, in many ways, split, how we conceive of Black solidarity, Pan-Africanism, and those kinds of ideas. And some might view it as being hostile to immigrants, be it from the Caribbean or from Latin America and so on. And I think how we can approach that is to understand how the larger system of white supremacy affects Black people, white supremacy is global. It is everywhere that white people have occupied space. So whether it's in Jamaica or it's in Haiti or it's in the DR or it's in Nigeria or Ghana or in Palestine, it actively inserts itself everywhere. And I think especially for those of us who are in the American space, as I think someone referred to earlier, is to understand how immigrants, how their lives are bound up with an imperialist system in America that damages those countries, that makes the lives of these people miserable, whether it's in the Middle East or it's in Latin America or the Caribbean, have been destabilizing governments, and make those places basically uninhabitable, right, for those kinds of people. And then they have to then make their way to other places in order to survive. So you cannot then, be then having this idea of Blackness that is kind of then one-dimensional, and not realizing that being bound up in this kind of a nationalist idea of Blackness then means that you are profiting from that imperialist machine in order to I guess further your own ends. So I would say having a broader transnational perspective of how whiteness, the very whiteness that you're battling against, how that operates not just on a national and a local level, but on an international level, I think can offer some solidarity to people who are immigrants.
Thank you so much for weighing in. All right, so our last audience question, and I'd love to hear from everyone because this is something that I think that we can all come together on. How can Black Americans build power and solidarity as we work for liberation and freedom when there's various issues that are constantly dividing us, as opposed to fighting oppressive powers? We're spending a lot of time that are leading us to fight over things that may be distractions. That was something an audience member wanted to know. What are your thoughts?
I think I can jump in. I think first identifying the white supremacist norms that are infecting us, like sexism and homophobia and transphobia and ableism and ageism and all sorts of things. So identifying those things. The next is Angela Davis said years ago when I got to hear her speak, we must become accustomed to criticizing the things we love. And that was talking about within the Black community. And so it's not anti-Black to say R. Kelly stopped sexually abusing girls. That's not an anti-Black statement. We should all be able to rally around that. And so being able, and when we don't do that, it's a perversion, right? It's a perversion to manipulate, that you don't get to actually say this is wrong because otherwise we're demonizing Black men just like the white people are. No. Where's the abuse happening? Abuse is happening very clearly from this person to all of these girls over decades. It's not anti-Black to say that. And we can say, if we love this community, like I believe lots of us do, we have to be identifying problems within it and not letting our fear of what the white they will think if we actually are addressing these problems.
Thank you. Someone else.
I think it's important to kind of understand and grapple with the history and legacy of settler colonialism and how all the structures that were created at that point in time, hundreds of years ago, are still existing today in more, I guess, more modern and more cosmopolitan forms, so to say. So the slave catchers, police, we see the different and we even see how different settler colonial states are using their military technology both abroad, but also on their own people as well. So you talk about something, so like the United States, there's a program called the 1033 program, which allows the military to give away their extra military equipment to police departments in the United States. So you literally have imperialism meant for abroad that's then brought back home and then inflicted upon Black people here in the United States. So like Ferguson activists literally were sharing tips and techniques for dealing with their for how to the different tear gas canisters. They were actually created by the same companies that were being used in Ferguson and in Palestine. Like it's literally the same companies that are providing the weapons that are being used against Palestinians and that are being used against Black people or any other person who's protesting that gets hit with tear gas. So the different manifestations of like social colonialism and how they manifest and shape and morphed over time, and understanding that history and how it's been a way to divide and conquer everyone, regardless of whether it's race, class, gender, any of the different things in which people are divided by, have been a result of these things from settler colonialism, because so many of these concepts were born from that. Like race itself as a concept comes out of trying to justify settler colonialism, trying to justify slavery. Like these are all epistemological and academic projects that were meant to uphold this structure. So,
Thank
history
you.
and that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. I'd like to hear from Reverend Mitchell, and then we'll close with Dr. Butler and Dr. Banton.
Thank you. My spin on this might be experienced as a rebuke, but I'm talking to my own people here. We have to be willing to divest from whiteness and whiteness's millennial grandchild, these cheap ideas of multi-ethnicity. If we release our need to create some idyllic space where everyone can be happy and live with one another, this bastardization of Dr. King's dream, this multi-ethnic utopia, we will have the room and power amongst ourselves to give the time to address our real issues, to talk amongst ourselves in our different diaspora factions, and to work out these massive gaps that we have in class and educational background. If we choose, there's this growing movement of folks who are becoming attracted to, these ideas of unity, and you can understand and know others and be about their liberation as well, while also having honor and respect for where you come from and being committed to your community. And I don't feel that folks who aren't willing to invest the time in their own community and in their space should have the right to say that we're dividing ourselves and that Black on Black crime is a bigger issue than police violence. Like, I don't believe you have the right to say that if you're not giving time to the people that are actually in that space and to the places that you come from. So if we are willing to divest from those spaces, we can really move to some max liberation.
Thank you. Dr. Butler or Dr. Banton?
Sure. I think there's like maybe two things I just want to highlight. I think the one, and you can see them as divergent paths if you like or not. I think the one is if you want to go fast, go by yourself. If you want to go far, go together. And I think this is where we talk about this idea of like, oh, we're divided. No, we're really just kind of figuring things out, and that takes time. And if you're okay with that, then let's continue to figure things out so we know where we're headed together. And then I think the other one that I like to highlight on is the question of is it okay to have factions within Black communities? Is it okay to have factions, and then is it okay to work laterally amongst factions as folks continue to try to usurp and dismantle white supremacy? If we're over here doing this and you all over there doing that, maybe that's okay for right now. And when it's time for us to link up and do this larger thing together, then we'll probably do that. And then we may go back to our factions. But the question becomes like, are we okay with the factions? Because I think this idea of like this Black universal is also a response to like whiteness being this white universal. So we must unify to destroy this thing. So it still plays back into the hand, and I don't think it's necessarily generative for the work that we're trying to do. And so I think it's okay for there to be kind of smaller pockets and quote unquote cells if we are terrorists to whiteness and white supremacy in this way. And so you can look at those two different potentially divergent ways of looking at it.
And I would just say, totally agree with that. And to just reiterate that Black people are capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. That, not because, an issue over here might not be important to you as this group or this faction does not necessarily means it's not an overall priority for someone else. And so I do agree with what Dr. Butler has said in terms of what I'm most interested in is it's finding out people who are operating in different lanes and saying, okay, I'm the loudmouth over here, you're over there in your administrative position, and if you need me to be a loudmouth so that you can make something happen, then let's link up and do that, right? I do this. Malcolm X and MLK had that understanding, right? That, you know, that both are needed, even though people view their positions, you know, historically as so diametrically opposed. But in fact, that there was some kind of dialectic that was happening there, that Malcolm X understood that whatever he was doing was enabling Dr. King works to go forward. So I think, again, you know, I coalition building within the Black community and recognizing, you know, how your work can enhance the work of another group or faction. I think that's where we can, you know, often put a lot of our energy, rather than thinking that we're not all, you know, we're not homogeneous as Black people, you know, and so that means that our approach and our priorities and the problems that we experience are not going to be the same. So, you know, having that idea, I think, will help to guide us.
Thank you so much. Our time is unfortunately drawing to a close. What an insightful and thought-provoking session, everyone. I hope you will join me in thanking our panelists for their expertise and experiences shared today. May freedom and liberation be with you and your communities. Have a great day.